I've got a sinus infection that's got me a headache also. It's affecting my voice a little bit too, so if I'm not loud enough, then
You know, sinus drain, you do that. A lot of goldenrod out there.
it'd be nice if it'd rain, and
I'm sorry.
if it would rain, it'd be nice.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Wash everything down.
all right, we covered verse 1 through 35 last week. And basically we talked about that being within those 70 weeks that we talked about back in chapter 9. And what we're going to find today is also within the 70 weeks, but specifically within the 70th week. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you before I start on verse 36 that when people get into this particular passage and they start studying this particular passage, there's as many different interpretations of this as there is different people in the world that's read it. And almost every interpretation includes speculation. I'm just going to tell you that to start with. Because we don't know for sure what a lot of this is. And as we go through it, I'll try to give you a little bit of warning about certain types of speculation that we should stay away from. Here's what I'm going to tell you. When you start talking about end times prophecy, it's fun to discuss and say, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. But you can get so involved in those discussions that you miss the big picture. And we want to make sure we don't miss the big picture. The big picture is Christ's kingdom came into the earth when he died on the cross. And his kingdom has been being built through the preaching of the gospel ever since then. And his kingdom will ultimately be fulfilled, and he shall reign in it when he returns. That's the big message. That God has ordained that Jesus Christ is going to rule the earth in his kingdom. That's the big picture. If you got that, you've got a good enough understanding of what's being told in Daniel chapter 11. But there's a lot more here that we can discuss, and it's interesting and fun to talk about maybe. When we get here to verse 36, I'll tell you, I don't know of anybody that still thinks that this is Antiochus Epiphanes when we get to verse 36. Pretty much everyone agrees. All the commentators I read agreed that this was something in the future after that, past that, because it does not accurately describe Antiochus Epiphanes, although verse 21 through verse 36 did accurately describe him. Verse 36 does not, so it has to be moving on. And it's not giving words to separate it. In verse 36 here, the version I use says, and the king. Does anybody have a version that says, then the king?
It says
Both.
So you have the new KJV, and it says, then the king, right? Okay. NIV, on KJV, says, and the king. If you want to use...
Say it one more time.
Some of them say then, in verse 36, some of them the first word is then the king.
That's,
And that gives a separation in it when you read it, when you have that reading of it. That all the older any version that's been around longer than like 1970s uses and.
and two, it's in quotation marks for some reason.
So, either way, there's a time break here. We don't know what the time break is, but we know we've moved from Antiochus Epiphanes on to something else. I don't know any commentators that do not agree on that. There is some difference in what we're going to be talking about here. John Calvin specifically believed that it was talking in very general terms just about the anti-God spirit that was seen throughout the Old Testament and the anti-Christ spirit which is seen throughout the New Testament. There's many people that put it as the papacy. It says that this is talking about the Catholic Church. There's a lot of people that puts it as Muhammad and the Muslims and that whole thing, and say it's fulfilled in that. I hold to the belief that it's speaking specifically of the Antichrist, specifically in the end times. But understand that within people that we would say those are solid biblical Christians, there's a wide range of beliefs on this. So understand that, and we'll get into it. One other thing before we get into it. When we come to passages of Scripture, really two things here, but it's just help on interpretation. You're smart people, you can interpret it however you want, and I think you'll be okay. But some things that'll help you. If we take the Bible, how many of you think we should take the Bible literally? I do. It means what it says. But if you take it literalistically, that means that specifically exactly what it says is exactly what's going to happen in the sense it's going to say stuff about in the battle there that you're going to have horses and people riding the horses and chariots. If you take that literally, that means there's an army. If you take it literalistically, it means it has to be horses and chariots. I don't know if I can get through this or not. So, we're going to take it literally. It means what it says, but it was written 3,000 years ago. And he could not write it with our vocabulary. He had to write it with his vocabulary. So when he looked at something, he described it as he saw it, just like John did in the book of Revelation. So many times in the book of Revelation, John uses the word liken to. Why did he use liken to? Because he didn't know what he's looking at. Yeah, go ahead. Y'all see back if you want to. I haven't wrote anything. John used liken to repeatedly because he didn't know how to describe. If when you were a kid, you were describing how we use cell phones today, how would you have described it?
Telegram.
There's just not a good way to describe it. So we have all these inventions that have happened since then that we have an understanding that we could not, in the Old Testament or even in the New Testament, they could not describe what they were seeing in terms of what we would describe it as seeing today. So we don't take it literalistically, we take it literally. It means what it says, but there is symbolic things there that we can argue about what they actually are. If you do much study on, especially in the book of Revelation, where you have locusts and these things that sting, you're going to hear people say, well, it's helicopters, or it's this, or it's that. Understand that any interpretation that we take and say, this is it, when they're using a description of something they didn't know how to describe, it is speculation. So we can't say this for sure is this for sure is this, when they were looking at something they didn't know what it was. So that's important as you get into this. The other thing, if you climb Mount Everest, anybody ever done that? No. But you've seen pictures of Mount Everest, right? From a distance, you can definitely see the peak of Mount Everest. But the people that's climbing Mount Everest, most of the time on their way there, they can't see the peak. Because there's other peaks between them and the peak. The closer you get to it, the harder it is to see it. Then you get to the top, and every once in a while you get a view of it. And then you go back down. It's something like 3 miles, or maybe more than 3 miles of their like last 2 days of trekking, whatever that is downhill, because they go over a peak, they go back down, and they lose sight of their goal. Well, prophecy's that way a lot. There's a peak out there, which is Christ, the kingdom, but there's a whole lot that you can't see as you go through it. And in the Old Testament, there's a whole lot that we can't see. If you want to write these passages down, you can, but Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, in Revelation 13. That would be probably the big three. That gives a description, a New Testament description of the Antichrist, and pretty good. Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, and Revelation 13. I think the Matthew 24 passage is in Mark and Luke, but in less detail. Matthew 24 is the most detailed of those three. But it's found in Mark and Luke also. All right, verse 36. And the king, I'm going to go ahead and teach it as this is the Antichrist. Because that's what I believe. Okay, but understand some people don't think this is the Antichrist. They think it's the spirit of Antichrist at least. All of them would agree with that. And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Extremely important phrase at the end of this verse. For that is determined shall be done. That is probably the most important phrase in this whole chapter. Is that whatever God has determined to do, that's what's going to happen. That's important in prophecy, that whatever God has determined to do in prophecy is going to happen. It's also important in your life that whatever God has determined to do is going to happen. And that we can trust that what God has said he will do. What God has promised will come to pass. So verse 36 there at the end, for that is determined shall be done. Verse 37, this is giving a description of the Antichrist, if you want to believe it as the spirit of Antichrist, either way. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. He's making himself God, so he doesn't care about the God of his fathers. Some people will say, well, this makes it where he has to be a Jew.
That's what I was thinking.
But remember, we just had a couple of chapters ago where some people say he has to be from Rome. By the way, we have someone in the Bible that would fit both of those two things. You know who it is? Who's a Jew with Rome? Paul. So it's not like it would be a rare thing for this to be able to be fulfilled. I don't think we have to stress over what country he's from, but understand people want to argue about these things because they shall not regard the God of his fathers, because pretty much everyone else at that time did not have a capital G-O-D, and it uses a capital G-O-D. So that would be why they use that emphasis. Nor the desire of women. Once again, this is greatly argued about. Some people will say this means he's a homosexual. The desire of women for Jews specifically, and a lot of commentators come down on this position, that the desire of women that their desire was to have the Messiah, and that was fulfilled in Mary. There's a lot of people who believe that, and it fits. If you go into the Hebrew and study it, it fits that there's a good chance that that's what it's talking about. That he would not regard the desire of women. In other words, he would not regard Christ. If you want to believe he's homosexual, that's fine. It's speculation either way. We don't know for sure. Whatever it means, it will be fulfilled, that it will be accurate. He shall nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. And there, right there in verse 37 is why we know that it's not Antiochus Epiphanes, because what was the image that he put up in the temple? It was Zeus. He did regard other gods. He shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces. And a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. The God of forces, his God is power, his God is strength, His God is everything that the flesh would desire. That's what he makes himself out to be. Verse 39. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. He's going to be someone who can appeal to people and is, I don't know, what's the word for it? Flattering. He's going to flatter people to get his way, to get them to like him. Remember we talked about earlier, he's a winner. People will follow after him. Verse 40, and at that time, at the time of the end, this is why we generally, most everyone agrees that this is happening at the end of time. That's an interesting phrase, though. Have you ever thought about the time of the end? That time is going to end? Do you think about it? Do you believe that? That everything that we have and everything we see, it's going to end? Revelation 20 says, time shall be no more. Time, as it was created in Genesis chapter 1, is done. It's over with. There is no more time. There's no morning, there's no evening, there's no night. Time is done. So when we try to think about infinity and then some of those things that we dealt with in math class in 7th, 8th grade or wherever it was that we dealt with them with, and you could never comprehend it. Parallel lines, what does a line do? It goes on indefinitely, right? And parallel lines go on indefinitely and they never cross. Only thing we deal with here on Earth is parallel line segments, right? We don't deal with actual lines, we deal with line segments because lines never end. So you have infinity and it's beyond our comprehension. We can't comprehend infinity. It's seen in things like pi. 3.14, and I don't know what the other numbers are, but after like 8 numbers, what does it start doing? It repeats itself over and over and over because you can never get the answer. 1/3, what is 1/3? 1.3333, and it goes on and on and on. And the further you go, the more accurate it is, but it never fully describes 1/3 in decimals. You can't do it. So it's incomprehensible. The math of it, the thought of it, it's incomprehensible that time's going to stop. There is an end. And at this end, and I don't want to, we're not going to turn to Matthew 24 or 2 Thessalonians 2 or Revelation 13, but I encourage all of you to read it, maybe this afternoon. Take a break from your football game during halftime or something and read those 3 passages, because when you read them all together, it really is helpful to read those passages together and realize that, hey, at the end of time, there's this huge Antichrist thing that happens on earth. And what's going to happen when that happens is that the real Christ is going to defeat the Antichrist. If you read them all together like that, you still won't get a full understanding of it, but you're like, okay, I can rest in the fact that Christ is going to win. All right, verse, where are we at? 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like the whirlwind. Okay, we're talking about literal and literalistically. Well, the first half of this chapter, the king of the south was the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the king of the north was, I forgot his name, the other dynasty, the one we talked about last week. When we get here, and even today, those 2 dynasties are gone. Those 2 dynasties have been gone for forever. So what people will start doing is they'll start making the king of the north and the king of the south specific countries. You can put this king of the north and king of the south as any countries you want to. It doesn't matter to me. It's not going to change anything other than there's 2 powers that come against the Antichrist.
I know for years I've heard King of the North is Russia. Ever since I remember it used to be out.
Yeah, that it was, and here's one of the reasons.
Somebody that preached on it, that's what I read in my Bible.
One of the reasons that's believed, I'm going to give you another, just something to think about. So once again, it's fun to think about. We don't know. It's something that's fun to think about. I'll give you a much different possibility that for whatever reason, everybody in America has never accepted this possibility because we're a good Christian nation. Why couldn't it be America? Why couldn't the East be China? There's no reason. It's speculation. If the Lord tarries is coming, China could be gone. We talked about this last week. The U.S. could be gone. China could be gone. It could be complete different powers on the earth. So, whatever you want to believe about who these people are, it's going to be speculation. King of the north and king of the south shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, it's Palestine, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. It could literally be talking about Edom, Moab, and the children of Ammon, or the Ammonites, or it could just be talking about the enemies of God. Because that's who the enemies of God were throughout the Old Testament, right? Edom, Moab, and the Ammonites. Which those people would include people like the Philistines and all those others that we talk about throughout the Old Testament. The enemies of God. I would hold the position that is talking about the enemies of God here. Verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. The news out of the east and out of the north. Whatever the news out of the east and out of the north is, we don't know what it is, but there's some news out of the east and out of the north that troubles this person who is basically taking over the world. And when you read those other three passages that I've given you, the way he's going to take over the world, basically, is through his flattery, through primarily signs and wonders. He's going to have power to do anything. He will be able to do miracles. He will call himself the Christ. And people will look at him and say, you know what, this is the Christ. Not a few people. The world's going to look at him and say, this is the Christ. Because he's going to declare himself as the Christ. And he's going to do miracles like Jesus did when he was here. And everyone's going to believe, not everyone, but almost everyone's going to believe, this is the Christ. But then there's going to be some bad news that comes out of the east and the west. Something that troubles him. Once again, if it was today, where does the news of the world come from today? Out of the east, that's going to be China, and out of the north, that's going to be North America. But that is speculation. So once again, you can't say that's who it is. You can say it's the north and the east, though, because that's what the Bible says. So we'll just stick with that. There's news, there's tidings that come that trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. He's going to rule the entire earth. And you can get into the amount of time he's going to do that in those other 3 chapters. He's going to rule the entire of the earth. And then the entire earth is going to turn their back on him and reject him. And the New Testament says that he will be killed by the breath of Christ. Christ is going to kill him. That's what's going to happen. Anybody that tries to put this, I'm not going to turn there, but anybody that tries to put this as being in AD 70, frankly, I'll just tell you to just reject it, because it doesn't make sense. Because Christ didn't come back to the earth in AD 70. There has not been a second coming yet. But when we get to the beginning of the next chapter, at the beginning of the next chapter, we'll cover it this week, it says, and at that time, when this happens, Remember, there's no real chapter breaks in the Bible. He shall come to his end, none shall help him, and at that time, well, you got to come back next week to find out what happens at that time. But it's at the end of time. And next week we get to deal with literally the end of all things. And Michael, if you have a title on your chapter, Michael, Archangel, shall deliver Israel from trouble. If you want to believe that, if you want to believe that the church is still here during this time, it's fine with me for you to believe that. I don't believe that. I believe we'll be gone. But if you want to believe that we're still here, there is some comfort in this. Still, is that Christ will deliver his people.
I don't understand right here, and none shall help him. I mean, I thought there's a lot of people following him right there at the end.
Up until that point, when he comes to his, I'll give you the perfect picture of it. How many people followed Hitler? Everybody in his country.
Yeah, I imagine everybody.
But at his end,
When they seen he was gonna be defeated,
no one,
no one, yeah,
everybody turned their back on. When they realized he was not what he presented himself to be.
I got you.
So at the end,
They was gonna kill him.
yeah,
I mean, his own people.
but you know, this spirit of Antichrist, you know, the New Testament talks about how it was in the world then. But the spirit of Antichrist, what do you believe is Antichrist, the spirit of Antichrist? What do you believe about it? From the beginning of time, in Genesis chapter 3, God has an ordained plan for mankind. And from the beginning of time, Satan has been fighting against it. In the Old Testament, it was seen as the spirit being anti-God and anti-Messiah. In the New Testament, it's the spirit of Antichrist. And here's what's important. That battle is going on and has been going on for all of time. What you need to realize is that battle is going on in you. You have a flesh, and your flesh is anti-Christ.
Right.
But you have a spirit and a soul that has been saved and is being saved. And God is working in you to will to do of his good pleasure. And you have this same battle that goes on throughout all of time that's going on in your life right now. And the question is, are you fighting that battle? That's the real question. Are we fighting this battle? Or are we losing? You're either fighting it or you're losing it, one or the other. You know, there's no in-betweens. Either your flesh is winning or the Spirit of God is winning in your life today. We know ultimately Christ will win. But what's happening in your life right now? Because you have the promises, the indicatives. You have imperatives. Go do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. Be holy. But you have the indicatives, Christ in you, to actually win the battle. You have the Word of God. You have a church. You have a pastor. You have all these things to help you win the battle. You have the indicatives to do the imperatives. We can win the battle, but we have to obey the Word of God to do so.
It's a constant battle.
It's till you die. It's a constant battle. Pastor talked about it in church a few weeks. You know, Steve Lawson fell here recently. Big name among the Reformed groups. He's a big name pastor in his 70s, and he fell. And we would look at that and say, you know, how can somebody be faithful in ministry for 50 years or whatever it was, and then fall into that type of sin? He stopped fighting the battle. In other words, he placed confidence in the flesh. How quick are we to place confidence in our flesh? There's things I would look and say, I'd never do that. But then I look back when I was 16 or 17, there's things I would say, I would never do that.
I've already done them.
And then I did them. can't place confidence in our flesh because our flesh is anti-God. It's anti-Christ. And we have to kill it and kill it and kill it and kill it and keep killing it every day. And thankfully, God's mercies are new every morning for us to fight that battle. Thoughts or questions? I know I didn't go with that. Part of that's